What is good, everyone? Today we'll be going through the cheapest Sony lenses there are to buy without skipping out on quality, and we'll be going through which ones you should pick up once you've picked up a brand new camera like the A7IV. But that being said, this can apply to the A7S3, basically any full frame Sony camera, so just keep that in mind. For these recommendations, I'm going to be really focusing on bang for your buck, and I'll also be supplying a lot of real world footage so you can decide on your own if you want the lens or not. So let's get into it. Alright, so the first lens you should buy, which will cover many different scenarios, is the classic 28 to 75 f2.8 Tamron. First, let's always go through bang for your buck. This thing will be extremely cheap, especially if it's secondhand. That's because the second version of this lens is actually out. I bought this for like $650, which is why this is like kind of scuffed up. And the reason we're going forward with this lens is, first of all, because we're poor, we can't really afford 100 different prime lenses. So this is 28 to 75, covers a huge range in everyday type of life. If you're shooting nature, if you're just going out and about in your day, 28 to 75 honestly probably covers about 75% of the focal length that you need. I think overall 28mm is perfectly fine for landscapes. It's only when you're in tighter spaces, for example like maybe a cave, that you might find a little bit restrictive, which is why we'll buy the other lens in a second. Other than going in nature, this lens has made its money back really quickly for me. It's the perfect type of lens if you're shooting anything run and gun, handheld, if you're going to shoot someone cooking. I've actually done a bunch of promos for different restaurants or whatnot using this lens. I know some people may have some slight concerns about the autofocus performance, but with the A7IV, this thing works like a dream. Even though it's the older Tamron, I really don't notice that much of an issue with it. I'll put all these clips to show for that. I feel like the focus has been perfectly fine, and I don't see any need to like buy a G Master, for example. In addition, talking about sharpness, I think this is extremely sharp as well. Again, that's not a scientific perspective from me, but just looking at my photos, I've never looked at a photo and thought, wow, this is so soft. Wow, this is not as crispy as my other lenses, because honestly, I feel like it does a perfectly fine job and nothing to complain at all in terms of sharpness, and just overall a great lens that you will not regret. Let's also quickly talk about alternatives for the 28 to 75. Obviously you can buy the 24 to 70 G Master, but I honestly think that's a bit of a waste of money. Maybe you can get some focus breathing compensation, but it's just not worth justifying twice the price for basically a very marginal improvement. Additionally, we also got the 24 to 70 Sigma lens, that's f2.8 as well. I've used that on the L mount system for my old camera, and my only issue with that is it's so heavy. It's like 1 kilo plus, and for me, I like hiking. It's just not worth it for me for that extra 4mm to carry all that extra weight. People might ask, is it worth the 28? Does that bother you that much? 24 to 28 doesn't really give you that much in certain scenarios. Like, I honestly feel like any shot I take with 24 could probably pass as 28 as well. It's not like if I'm in a tight space like a cave, 24mm will be perfect, because honestly that's not wide enough either. We do have the 28 to 70 Sigma lens. That's also an option, but the resale market on this is just so much greater because it's such an OG lens, and that's basically all the alternatives there. Alright, so the second lens I would recommend, which is actually the first lens I bought brand new, is the Tamron 17 to 28mm wide angle lens. So first of all, for bang for your buck, this is an OG Tamron lens which you can save a lot of money in the second-hand market. Obviously I bought this brand new, and I probably prefer to buy the second-hand because you're really not getting that much. I haven't had a horrible incident yet, so keep that in mind. There's always a risk buying secondhand lenses, but the secondhand market for this goes crazy and you can get a lot cheaper. So as someone who loves adventuring and landscapes, this is fairly compact. It's not too heavy. The 17 to 28mm is a classic wide angle lens that you really need for many different situations, especially if you're in nature. Anything that has tight spaces, for example caves, you'll really appreciate the extra 17mm super wide angle look. You can also take real estate photos with this shot if you really want to, and this is great for astrophotography even though it's f2.8. I know it is f2.8, honestly that's good enough, especially for these modern day Sony cameras. I do think the wide angle is quite a must buy for the A7IV because you've got the 4K 60 that's cropped, you've got active stabilization which is cropped like 1.1 to 1.2 times as well, so having this super wide 17mm is really important in my opinion. In regards to sharpness, it's really sharp. Autofocus is great, especially because it's such a wide lens. You won't get that much background separation anyway, so all of that works great, and there's really nothing for me to comment on that because it just works great and I really have no complaints. This is definitely the cheapest wide angle lens. Like I mentioned before, this is all over the secondhand market, so you can get a secondhand lens for super cheap. Alright, so let's talk about quick alternatives. Obviously there's the 16 to 35 f2.8 G Master, which I would actually consider upgrading maybe way down the line, because having that reach to 35mm instead of 28mm would actually make a bit of a difference to me. I feel like if you just zoomed in a little bit more, you could have a little bit more bokeh and it'd prevent me from switching my lens a little bit more. So there is slight FOMO in regards to that sense. But then flipping that around, extra 7mm for an extra 1 grand, is it? It's a lot of money. Probably not worth it. We also got the Sigma 14 to 24mm lens, which is a super wide angle lens. You'd be surprised the difference between 14 and 17mm is actually a fair amount. So if you want that crazy wide angle shot with foreground, everything in the frame, then that's probably what you should be looking for. But I personally think 17mm is perfectly fine and wide enough. And Sigma actually released a new 16 to 28mm lens, which is 1mm extra. And like I mentioned, an extra millimeter at the 16 side versus 17 is actually a bit of a fair amount. I would probably buy that Sigma lens versus this if I had the option to buy both brand new, but if you're buying secondhand, then this is the only one that will be there. So that are the first 2 Tamron lenses, which are perfect for broke boys like me. So the third lens you want to buy if you're trying to save money as a Sony E-mount user without sacrificing quality is kind of up to interpretation. The first 2 lenses are absolutely must-buys. They cover so much range. They really run and gun, prevent you from buying a lot more primes that you don't really need if you're trying to save money. But I personally bought the 55mm f1.8 Zeiss lens. So let's unpack this a little bit. Right off the bat, you might be thinking, wait a minute, this is the expensive $1,000 55mm lens, which is probably not cheap at all. And you'd be surprised how cheap these are on the secondhand market, because they're such an old lens that there's so many floating around that you can buy secondhand. I actually bought this for about like 550 Australian dollars versus the 50mm cheap f1.8 is about like $200 left. I honestly think this is worth an extra $200. The sharpness on this lens is absolutely insane, and it's just a great lens to use. The build is so much nicer and it's super light, worth carrying everywhere, especially because I do go on so many different hikes and I need to keep my kit light and compact, and this is the definition of that. The reason we're looking into primes now is that we've got 17 to 75mm all checked with those Tamron lenses, and you really need to make the most of your full frame camera by getting f1.8, f1.4 lenses to get that beautiful bokeh. So this is basically my bokeh monster, and that's what I kind of had in mind. That being said, I feel like I probably use the f1.8 55mm the least out of my other 2 lenses, because 55mm with that active stabilization crops in a little bit. I really have to take a few steps back, and I prefer to just like be in the moment with my friends instead of like trailing behind them and trying to get the shot. So that's a reason why I don't really use this lens that much. And just on a side note, I bought my first G Master, the 24mm f1.4, which is the cheapest G Master. It's not gonna be in this video because I don't think it's the wisest cheap option, but that's kind of like my bokeh monster now. But for the general public, this is a perfect portrait lens that you can use, and shooting primes using the f1.8, it's definitely helped me out in some really dark situations as in low light situations, because at the end of the day, some places are just really damn dark. It's like that night festival I shot the other day. Could really use this f1.8, and I'm glad I had it on me. So that kind of leads me to other options you can buy for this lens. Obviously, some people might not think it's very wise. If I've only covered from 17 to 75, why am I buying a 55mm lens? Again, that's because we really need bokeh, but I do understand some people might want to push it to 85mm if they like portraits that look like that. At that point, it's just up to what prime lenses you want, but you definitely, for your third lens, I reckon you should buy a prime. You could also argue that you should buy a telephoto lens beyond 75mm. So there's the 70 to 180 f2.8 Tamron, which is a very affordable option. Obviously we're shooting Tamron because we're poor, but if I was actually looking for a telephoto lens and extending my range, I would probably buy that lens. Alright, so those are the 3 lenses I would buy, starting out with the Sony A7IV and basically any hybrid shooting Sony camera. I think overall those first 2 lenses, the 17 to 28 and the 28 to 75, is extremely important because you need wide angle lenses to cover those Sony A7IV issues and crops that you always have to deal with. I do think for the third option you need a prime lens. That's kind of up to you which one you want to buy, but you are missing out on a bit of bokeh with those f2.8 lenses. Not saying you can't get that there, but it is noticeably more creamy and beautiful on f1.8/1.4 lenses. Given those 3 lenses, you probably don't even need another lens for a very long time. It'll probably satisfy like 75% of the population. I know some people might want to extend that range even further and buy a telephoto zoom lens, which is perfectly fine, but realistically a lot of the times you don't need that lens unless you're really into street photography or shooting nature, wildlife, or maybe like getting pictures of mountains. And overall, I feel like that's the best bang for your buck way to start on the A7IV or any other hybrid Sony camera. If you got something out of this, leave a comment, leave a like, and I'll catch you in the next one.